passions of the wars of the French Revolution with the technology, productive capacity, and managerial style of an emergent industrial society. Now I think that's a key right there. It has the productive capacity, the technology, the managerial style of an emergent industrial society. No one was more efficient than the Americans. Nobody. And they still aren't today. So what can happen when Americans try to kill Americans? Ingenious, dedicated people. Both the Union and the Confederacy fielded armies that dwarfed all military formations previously seen in the New World. They supplied these vast hosts with food, munitions, and equipment shipped by rail and steamship. They connected units hundreds of miles apart with webs of telegraph lines and motivated soldiers and civilians alike with ceaseless barrages of political propaganda. When necessary, they repressed dissent with intimidation and arbitrary arrests. Now, that's one of the biggest beefs that DeLorenzo has with Lincoln, is all of the little dictatorial, petty stuff that he did. We can make a really good case that we should have preserved freedom of speech, especially during wartime, so that people could speak freely about, criticize the war plans, maybe come up with a better way to fight the war. So we can certainly make that case, but we've restricted freedoms in virtually every war we ever fought. Not that it's acceptable or good, but does that hold anything against Lincoln's accomplishment? Does it? I just can't see it. He's got to build a better case than that. Let us continue. Before the war was half over, both sides abandoned cherished notions of the individual liberty and conscripted men to serve in the armies. In their quest to finance the struggle, they trampled venerable ideas about limited taxation and fiscal rectitude. And by the war's third year, they had begun to accept a tax upon enemy civilians and property as necessary and even virtuous. We held that viewpoint right up through World War II. Both sides mobilized their resources and population to the utmost limit of their mid-19th century ability. And when they reached the end of that ability, they strove for ways to extend it. The Union and the Confederacy, in short, waged a total war, a war in which both societies pitted their full destructive energies against each other. And there had never been societies with so much energy before. So why was it so deadly? More and more I see we can't put it on Lincoln's shoulders, can we? Okay, the central issue of the war was slavery. Quote, although many Americans did not accept this at the time, and some still do not today. One alternative view suggests that the Civil War was a struggle over states' rights versus centralized government. However, most Northerners believed in states' rights as much as most Southerners. So they weren't saying states don't have rights, they were saying you're not going to carve off a piece of our land and live on it with a bunch of slaves. Another regarded as a contest between an agrarian South and an industrialized North, neglecting to note that the northern states were also primarily agricultural at the time. In the case of the Midwest, overwhelmingly so. Still another posit a conflict between two allegedly distinct cultures, overlooking the fact that the North and the South shared a common language, a common history, and a common belief in republican government. Such political, economic, and cultural differences as did exist could be traced by and large to a single source. I think we've looked at that fact before, the fact that the South was a slave-holding society and the North was not. The Roots of War. That's the overtitle here. By the mid-19th century, slavery had become the South's bedrock institution. In the 250 years since the first shackled Africans had arrived on American shores, and especially in the decades following the American Revolution, white Southerners had evolved a complex set of beliefs about their peculiar institution. Not only did they consider it vital for the cultivation of the region's major cash crops, we couldn't grow cotton if it weren't for slaves. They also thought it the only acceptable basis on which whites and blacks could coexist. Until the late 1840s, this tension between pro- and anti-slavery forces remained largely submerged. It surfaced rapidly when the Mexican War broke out. Many Whigs and some Northern Democrats regarded the conflict as nothing but a naked land grab by Southern slaveholders eager to extend slavery into Mexico. See, they didn't invade Canada and grab land from Canada, they went south. In August 1846, anti-slavery Congressman David Wilmot of Pennsylvania introduced a resolution that formally renounced any intention by the United States to introduce slavery into any lands that might be seized from Mexico during the war. This Wilmot proviso failed to pass both houses of Congress, but it succeeded in re-injecting slavery into the national political life. For the next 15 years, the question of slavery in the territories constantly dogged American policymakers. Throughout the 1850s, both sides saw evidence to support their own beliefs, but political compromise grew more difficult. An attempt to permit Western settlers to decide for themselves whether a given territory would be slaveholding or free degenerated into violence. We've already seen this as Bloody Kansas, when the rival factions in Kansas Territory undermined the democratic process through intimidation, fraud, and murder. So they said, let's just let people vote on it. And the abolitionists were like, you're not going to vote people's rights away. We won't have it. Then in 1859, the abolitionist terrorist John Brown raided Harper's Ferry, Virginia, hoping to foment a slave insurrection. The operation was a fiasco. Brown was captured and hanged, as were most of his followers who survived the attack itself. But the Harper's Ferry raid shocked the entire white population of the South, especially when they discovered that a few northern abolitionists had helped finance Brown's attack. The fact that many in the North considered Brown a martyr only increased the Southern sense of anger and alienation. So here we have privately raised, privately funded groups invading, for all intents and purposes, foreign territory to damage what those foreigners consider to be their rights and property. And this is in 1859, 2 years before war even broke out. For 30 years, some Southerners had discussed the possibility of secession if the national government ever threatened the continued existence of slavery. For 30 years it had been on the table. The election of Republican candidate Abraham Lincoln seemed to bring that threat uncomfortably near. Why? Now, if it's true that Lincoln, because, you know, he freed the slaves in 1863, they say, not earlier. He should have freed them earlier if that's why he was doing it. He wasn't actually doing the war to free the slaves. He was doing it for some other reason. And he just freed the slaves because it was a good political move. He really didn't care about freeing the slaves. When he got elected, they knew from his career and his speeches and his beliefs, and Abraham Lincoln had been, for a generation, a certain personality on the national stage. So when he was elected, they were like, you know what, we're out of here then. If you think he's going to be president over us, baloney. We're going to keep slavery. Screw you if you're going to elect Lincoln. Screw you, we're out of here. So if anyone thinks that it's not about slavery, it's about slavery. The whole issue is about slavery, and Lincoln hated slavery and wanted to abolish slavery. That's why the whole thing erupted. His party openly opposed the extension of slavery in the territories, and although Lincoln renounced any intention to touch slavery where it already existed, as president, he would have power to appoint judges and federal marshals in the South. Such officials, indispensable to maintain the system of law and order on which slavery depended, would now be of dubious loyalty to the peculiar institution. Perhaps most gallingly, Lincoln won election despite the fact that hardly any Southerners had voted for him. Did you know this? In most slaveholding states, he had not even been on the ballot. He won about 40% of the election because there were two other people running, and so he got the plurality. He got the biggest chunk of anyone, but he didn't get the majority. Quote, many Southerners now sensed that they had lost control of the national government. They could no longer expect the government to preserve slavery. Honor and self-interest dictated that they must leave the Union if they expected to retain control of their own destinies. The secessionist impulse was particularly strong in South Carolina, a state in which slaves outnumbered whites and which had a long tradition of radicalism on the subject of slavery. Can you imagine all of a sudden half of the population, which had been subject to whipping and murder, is all of a sudden just walking around with the same rights as me and you? They wouldn't have it. These people who lived there wouldn't have it. On December 20th, 1860, a convention of South Carolinians